Hi, I'm Mike Beliveau, and today I'm going to be giving you a video that a lot of you have asked for, and you may be getting more than you bargained for, I don't know, but I'm going to try to cover the guns that Clint Eastwood used in Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. Now, those were three Western movies that Sergio Leone made with Clint Eastwood. It was Fistful of Dollars for a few dollars more, and the magnum opus, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Now, I honestly tried to do this as three videos, one on each of those movies, but it just didn't work. The stories of making those movies are so intertwined that it really only holds together if you do it as one complete piece. So that's what we're going to do today. Now, as usual, and maybe a little more than usual, I'm going to give you the background on the movies first. And there's going to be quite a bit of it. And as I go through each movie, you're going to be getting more background mixed in with that. So it's not going to be as clean as just fast forwarding to the guns if you only want to see the guns. So I just recommend that whenever I'm talking too much, fast forward till you see a gun on the screen, watch there. And if I'm talking too much for you again about another movie, just fast forward a little bit more and you'll get to the guns of that movie. So without further ado, let's get into the meat of the video. During the 1950s and the early 1960s, Western television shows ruled the airwaves on American television. But by the mid-60s, that trend was starting to wane. And as it hit its peak and started to go down, that's exactly when a young, inexperienced Italian movie maker decided that he was going to make a Western. Leone was 15 cut. At the time, Sergio Leone was 35 years old. And he already had a good reputation as an assistant director in Italian movies. But he only had one movie under his belt as an actual director. And that was a pretty typical, what they would have called a swords and sandals movie of the day, or a gladiator movie of the day. But now Leone was ready to tackle his second film. And this one would be a Western. Now, despite the way things eventually worked out, Clint Eastwood was not even on Sergio Leone's radar as a star in this movie. Sergio was aiming big, as he always tended to do. So, Leone had really always pictured Henry Fonda as the lead in his Western. But when he approached him, Fonda's people wouldn't even talk to him. I mean, literally would not even entertain the offer. A lot of you probably realize that was kind of ironic, because after Sergio Leone became famous, Fonda did end up starring in one of his Westerns. It was called Once Upon a Time in the West. And we may cover that at some future date. But when Leone was an unknown, Fonda had nothing to do with him at all. That's also kind of ironic that when Sergio Leone did make Once Upon a Time in the West with Fonda starring, he wanted Clint Eastwood to co-star with Fonda. And Clint refused because, first of all, he and Sergio Leone had kind of gotten tired of each other. Clint certainly got tired of Sergio. But Clint's vision was to make his own movies in Hollywood, and he was not interested in making any more European movies. So Charles Bronson ended up getting the co-starring role in Once Upon a Time in the West. Now, after Fonda flatly turned him down, Sergio Leone approached James Coburn for the lead in his movie. And Coburn asked for $250,000 as his salary, which, by the way, probably exceeded the amount of money that Sergio Leone had for his entire budget, because he only had between $200,000 and $250,000 to make this movie. So there's no way that he could pay Coburn $250,000. So next, Leone actually went to Charles Bronson. And after Bronson read the script, he declared it as garbage and refused to do it. So next he tried Cliff Robertson. Cliff also wanted too much money. So Leone was starting to get desperate. Someone convinced him to have a look at a TV star in Hollywood, and particularly a star on the series Rawhide. So Leone was getting desperate, and some of the people he was working with told him maybe he should step down a notch and try to get a well-known American TV star. So he decided to go after the star of the TV series Rawhide. But that was not the star you were thinking of. He actually approached Eric Fleming. Fleming was playing the lead on Rawhide, trail boss Gil Favor. And Fleming turned him down. He wasn't interested in going to Europe to make a movie. But he said, my co-star, Clint Eastwood, might be interested. You should go look him up. Now, Clint at that time knew that after 5 seasons of Rawhide, it was on its downhill slide. Ratings were starting to go down. He wasn't sure how much longer it would be on, and Clint was looking for the next thing. And for him, he really wanted that next thing to be movies. So Leone approached him. Now, Leone offered him $15,000 to star in the movie, flat fee, plus a per diem to have living expenses while he was filming in Italy and Spain. Now, the numbers that I quoted before, 200,000, 250,000 that Henry Fonda wanted, those were the numbers for a top Hollywood star. Even for a top TV star, which really Clint Eastwood was at the time, he was extremely popular on Rawhide, he should have been at least in the $100,000 range. So $15,000 is tantamount to pocket change for making an entire movie. But Eastwood decided he was going to do it. He was looking for a chance to ditch his Rowdy Yates image and carve a new niche for himself, and he thought that this movie might just do it. Eastwood said, I was tired of the Rawhide morality. He said, in most Hollywood Westerns, good guys all seem to work for everyone but themselves. I like the idea, he said, of a lead character who's in it for what he can get, who only thinks about himself. And he picked the right character, that's for sure. Now, Eastwood figured, worst case scenario, that the movie would be a flop. It would never be seen in the U.S., so it would not affect his reputation one way or the other. He would learn something while he was doing it, and he'd get to spend some time in Italy and Spain. He'd never been to Europe, so, you know, it kind of looked like a paid holiday when this all wrapped up. So he decided, even for $15,000, worth doing. Before he left for Italy, because not only was he only paid $15,000, but Leone asked him to provide his own wardrobe and gun for the movie. So he was his own prop department, right? So before he left for Italy, Clint bought some black Levi's, blue jeans, black jeans in this case, that he distressed before he left to give him a good worn look. He found a hat he liked at a costume shop in Santa Monica. Then he went, because he was still working for Rawhide, he still had at least one more season to go. He went to the Rawhide props department because this was going to be their summer hiatus. And he borrowed from the prop guys the boots that he wore in the series, the gun belt that he wore in the series, which was an Andy Anderson walk and draw rig that they had ordered in the second or third season from Anderson's gunfighter shop in North Hollywood. And he took a gun out, and the gun he took ended up being a phenomenal choice because he selected a gun that he acquired in the second episode of the first season of the show. So he had his boots, his clothes, his Andy Anderson fast draw rig, and the 5.5-inch barrel Colt single action revolver that he was going to use. And he had no idea that that gun was going to become as iconic as Paladin's chest piece on his holster was to Richard Boone. That this gun would be associated with Clint Eastwood forever. Now, when Clint got to Italy, which was his first stop, one of the first things he did was he bought some long, thin, very dark black cigars, and he cut them in thirds. Now, Clint personally was not a tobacco smoker, but he saw his character as a guy who hid behind his cheroot. And it allowed him to keep his hands busy with lighting it and holding it. And it gave him a slightly sinister air. And as Clint later said, boy, those cigars tasted awful. They really put you in the mood for killing. Now, he went from Italy to Spain, and when he got to Spain, he found a poncho that he liked. And that poncho, which was tobacco brown with a pattern of white zigzags and diamonds around the collar, and just a little bit of fringe, that became as iconic to him as Sean Connery's tuxedo as James Bond was to Sean Connery. So Eastwood arrived in Spain ready to work, and his plan had been to show up, keep his head down, do his job, learn what he could, enjoy being in Spain, collect his $15,000, and get home. Period. But as he got into filming and had to work with that script, he just decided that the way they wrote his character was simply not going to work. Because he was talking all the time. All the time. He was always giving exposition, giving his backstory, going through the reasons why he was doing things. And now Sergio Leone had not written the script. His assistant director had. So when Eastwood approached Sergio Leone and said, look, too much dialogue. Let me do this my way. I can do more just with a look than I can saying all of this. We can cut most of this dialogue out. Well, and the assistant director was incensed. But Sergio Leone decided to try it because, to be honest with you, it fit into Sergio's vision of cinematography because he loved those intense close-ups where you just focused on the character's face. And that was something that Clint Eastwood could deliver in spades. So he decided to see if it was going to work. Now, the lack of dialogue might have worked for Sergio Leone, but it scared the heck out of his German and Italian investors. Because they saw the Russians and they said, this guy never talks. He doesn't say anything. He just smokes and spits. We might not be paying him a lot, but we are paying him, and we expect him to do something to earn that money. But Leone said, trust me on this. This is going to work. And he was right, of course. As it turned out, A Fistful of Dollars became a huge success in Europe. Way more than anybody would have thought, particularly for a movie with that budget. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the guns in A Fistful of Dollars. There were some actual Colts used on the set, but most of the revolvers in A Fistful of Dollars were Italian clones of the Colt Single Action Army. And this was right at the dawn of the Italian replica industry. They had been making cap and ball revolvers since the late 50s. But they had just gotten into making cartridge firing revolvers. So these were some of the new guns on the Italian market that Leone was using in this movie. These guns are easily spotted because at that time, the Italians were making all of their Colt replicas with brass grip frames. And they did this because it was cheaper to do, because they could just take the brass grip frames that they were making for their 1851 Navy cap and ball replicas and slap them on the cartridge Colts. And people were buying them up, even though they were inauthentic. But one real Colt that was on the set was Eastwood's gun. And that was the gun that he brought for the Rawhide props department. It was a really well-worn Colt single-action Army revolver. This was not a fancy new gun. It had a 5.5-inch barrel, and it had very unique grips. It had wooden grips. They were walnut grips. The finish was very worn on them. But on each grip panel, there was a coiled silver rattlesnake inlaid that took up the whole length of the grip panel. Now, there's a lot of misinformation about this gun on the internet. I'm going to try to clear that up because I did a lot of research on this and I think I've got it pretty well figured out. So if we go back to Rawhide, Clint Eastwood's character, Rowdy Yates, ended up claiming this revolver. And it was in an episode titled Incident at Alabaster Plain. And it was the second episode of the first season. It originally aired on January 16th, 1959. In that episode, Eastwood's character, Rowdy Yates, confronts a gunfighter named Ward Mastick. And at the end of the episode, or close to the end of the episode, Mastick is killed. Now, he's not killed in a gunfight with Clint Eastwood. Spoiler alert, he gets knocked out of a bell tower in a Spanish adobe church by a huge bell. As it is swinging, it hits him and knocks him out of the bell tower. He falls to his death. And Clint Eastwood claims the rattlesnake grip revolver for himself after Mastick's death. Now, as far as I can see, and I have looked at a lot of Rawhide episodes, Eastwood did not use that gun in the rest of the series. He used a 5.5-inch Colt that had plain wood grips on it. So that gun went back into the prop department and stayed there, for years, I guess. And I suppose Eastwood borrowed it because nobody cared to use it again. So it was not going to be missed at any time while he was using it. If it was damaged during filming, no big deal. But actually it ended up being quite a big deal because those grips made it instantly recognizable as Clint Eastwood's gun, as his Italian Western gun. Now, I know this is the same gun that he used in Rawhide because of the way the grips are worn. And you don't really get a great look at the gun in most of the movie. But when you do get a good enough look at it, you can tell that the grips in the gun are worn, that it's the same one. So that's pretty much the story of a Fistful of Dollars, which I'm going to tell you, from my perspective, is the least good movie of the trilogy. I'm not a big fan of A Fistful of Dollars. But it did a lot of good for Sergio Leone and for Eastwood. So the one problem that it caused, though, was A Fistful of Dollars got Sergio Leone embroiled in a big lawsuit with a Japanese director named Akira Kurosawa, who claimed that the plot of A Fistful of Dollars was stolen directly from one of his samurai movies that he made in 1961 called Yojimbo, or Yojimbo. I'm not sure how you pronounce it in Japanese. And he was right, by the way. Sergio Leone pirated the idea and translated it to a Western in Europe. Now, Kurosawa ultimately won his suit. Well, actually, it was settled out of court. but it took years. And the unsettled legal issues around A Fistful of Dollars kept any American distributor from being willing to touch it. It did not make an American release, but its release in Europe was huge. So Eastwood found himself in a pretty strange position. He was now one of the biggest stars in Italy. In fact, he was a bigger star than Marcello Mastroianni in Italy. And nobody in America had any idea at all. But back in Europe, investors were eager to load Sergio Leone down with money to make another Western movie and to have Clint Eastwood star in it. And this time, Leone was going to have a realistic budget. So Clint agreed to come back and play the lead. But this time he was not going to be alone. There would be another English-speaking actor on the set. Now, if you don't know, the way Sergio Leone filmed these Westerns is he filmed them without sound, because everybody on the set spoke their own language. So while Clint was speaking English, the person he was playing against might be speaking German or Italian, totally incomprehensible to each other. So Sergio Leone just cut all the sound out, and all of the sound was dubbed in later. So Clint Eastwood's dialogue was all overdubbed after the movie was shot. So Clint Eastwood dubbed his own dialogue for the English language version of it. But other people dubbed his dialogue for the Italian version and for the Slovakian version and for the French version, etc., etc. And they put all the sound effects in and all that. So when you watch it, you can kind of tell that things don't really line up perfectly. And that was going to be the case on the next movie, which would be For a Few Dollars More. So where Fistful was about a loner who comes into town and stirs things up, the new film was going to be a two-hander, with Clint Eastwood's character finding himself in a rivalry with a new character known as Colonel Mortimer, who was a bounty hunter with a military background. Now I'm going to tell you, Sergio Leone is terrible with names. And we call this a trilogy, but it's really not. The three movies are completely unrelated to each other in terms of plot or continuity. So Eastwood's name in the first movie, Fistful of Dollars, was Joe. Took a lot of thought. In the second movie, A Few Dollars More, his name was Manco, which basically means one-handed. And it seems to be because he was wearing a leather brace on his wrist. But Manco it was. And Colonel Mortimer was the co-star. Now, cast as Colonel Mortimer would not be Henry Fonda or Charles Bronson or Robert Ryan or Lee Marvin or Jack Palance, all of whom were approached for it. They all either refused it or they wanted way too much money. Even though he had a bigger budget, his budget was still not huge by Hollywood standards. He couldn't afford any of those guys. So he needed a bargain basement actor. And he went shopping for one. And the one he chose was Lee Van Cleef. Now, Lee had been on a pretty good trajectory. He started his career playing a bad guy in High Noon. And he had a pretty good career going, mostly playing bad guys, the heavies in Westerns and, some other movies. But unfortunately, a bad automobile accident took him out of Hollywood for a number of years. And it ruined his career. So by the mid-1960s, he was barely eking out a living, actually doing home renovation and carpentry work. So Leone was able to get him really cheap. Van Cleef agreed to sign on to play Colonel Mortimer for a fixed salary of $17,000 and a expense per diem while he was overseas filming. And he only got $17,000 because he owed $5,000 and needed that money, and he wouldn't do it unless he made at least $10,000 in his pocket. So he managed to negotiate Leone up to $17,000, and he took the role. So Leone got him cheap, and he got him fast. Believe it or not, this deal was sealed with an attaché case full of cash in a plane ticket. And within 2 days, Lee Van Cleef was in Spain on the set. Now, in my opinion, a few dollars more is 100 times better than A Fistful of Dollars as a movie. And not just because of Van Cleef, though he has a lot to do with it, but it actually has a little bit of a better story. You can tell there's more money put into it, and it's just overall a better movie. So let's talk about the guns of A Few Dollars More. Thanks to A Fistful of Dollars, Clint Eastwood's Colt with the rattlesnake grips was now famous. I mean, absolutely famous. And Sergio Leone insisted on using it in the second movie as well. But there was a little bit of a difference, because in this movie, Leone actually had a budget. So, along with Clint's gun, which was an actual Colt, he had 2 Italian clones made up that had rattlesnakes inlaid on their grips. But, of course, as all Italian clones, these had brass grip frames. So whenever one of those is used in a scene, it's readily apparent that it's not the same gun that Eastwood typically uses. So during the movie, Eastwood goes back and forth between the clones and his own gun with the actual Colt. Now, even though Eastwood uses his snake grip guns through most of the movie, it's Van Cleef who uses it in the final showdown scene. So they both get to use the snake guns. And spoilers, I'm not going to tell you what happens in it, but Van Cleef borrows Clint's walk and draw rig and his snake gun. Now there is at least one other Colt in the movie, and it's very prominent. Notably, the lead bad guy, who's known as El Indio, and he is played brilliantly by Gian Maria Volonté, who does a great job in that role. He is armed with a Colt single-action Army with a full 7.5-inch barrel and black hard rubber grips that he carries bandolier style in a holster that's slung over his shoulder and across his chest. And really, he's got a beautiful Colt, much nicer than Eastwood's Colt. Lee Van Cleef also has a fairly unique gun in the movie. Now, Van Cleef uses a number of guns, and he's got a lot of guns that are in this roll attached to his saddle that he unrolls down the side of his horse and pulls a gun out that he wants to use. It's just totally unrealistic, but very cool. But his principal gun is a 12-inch barreled Colt buntline model, but this is an Italian clone of the same, and you can tell because it has brass grips. But it also has a detachable shoulder stock, and Van Cleef carries it in an Andy Anderson cross-draw rig. It's black. The holster is the same shape as Eastwood's, except it's made for the cross-draw, so it rides higher on the belt. And most of that barrel sticks out the bottom of that holster. And Van Cleef wields that gun very well throughout the entire movie. Now, the closing gunfight between Colonel Mortimer and El Indio, that is basically brokered by Eastwood at at gunpoint. And the gun in question is really a unique gun that you just do not see hardly ever. Because it looks like a Henry rifle, but it's not. It's a volcanic rifle. And that is an original, obviously. And maybe they couldn't get a Henry in Europe. I don't know. But the volcanics preceded the Henry. And they fired a cartridge, if you will, that was made up of a hollow-based lead bullet. And the bullet was the entire cartridge case. Its base was filled with powder. And it had a paper primer basically glued on over the powder charge. And that was the precursor to the Henry rifle, which used metallic cartridges, which was the precursor to the Winchester. So it all started with the Volcanic, which was made by Smith & Wesson. And it's pretty interesting to see it in a movie. Now, obviously, they couldn't shoot it. There's no ammunition for that. So it was just for pointing at people. But very, very cool. So for a few dollars more, was also incredibly popular in Europe. So Eastwood is riding this wave in Europe, and nobody in America knows he's done this stuff. And Rawhide comes to a close. So it's kind of ironic. But as I said, with the second movie, Clint Eastwood was the most popular movie star in Italy, bar none. And those movies were making money. And that money finally caught Hollywood's eye. But of course, they had this problem with Kurosawa. So Sergio Leone and his producers entered talks with an American distributor, United Artists. And United Artists brass thought that they could reach an out-of-court settlement with Kurosawa. So therefore, they were willing to talk to Leone. And not only about distributing the first two movies, but United Artists wanted Leone to make a third movie, and they were willing to finance it. And they were willing to put an appreciable budget behind it. As it turned out, Leone did not have a script for a third movie at all. But he had an idea. Once again, the third film was going to feature familiar themes. It would feature the lone stranger, the greed as a motive, the cynical look at morality, and it would feature Sergio Leone's signature cinematography. But this time, Leone wanted the story to play out against the backdrop of the American Civil War. Leone's idea was that there would be a pair of rivals, played by Eastwood and Van Cleef, trying to recover a treasure trove, basically, that was a fortune in gold that was hidden in a cemetery near the front lines of battle. So United Artists heard that and said, done. They almost broke their fingers writing him $1 million check to get things started. But they did want some changes. First of all, they wanted Leone to add a third protagonist who could be both a partner and a rival to one of the leads. And that ended up being pure genius. And of course, they wanted Clint Eastwood to star, and they wanted Lee Van Cleef to co-star in it. And third party, yet unknown. So Clint's deal to appear in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was a salary of $250,000, recognizing his ascension to the top tier of movie stars. He also asked for, and this was very intelligent, 10% of the film's Western Hemisphere gross. And that was a smart add-on for Clint, because eventually it far exceeded his salary. So, all told, his starting paycheck was 15 times higher than the $15,000 he was paid to make the first movie. That's pretty wonderful. And Sergio Leone got as the third lead Eli Wallach, as you all know. And Wallach had starred in The Magnificent Seven as a Mexican gang leader, bandit leader. And in Sergio Leone's mind, he was the perfect guy to play a Mexican bandit in his film by the name of Tuco. So now we'll talk about the guns. As I said, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was set during the American Civil War. And to Sergio Leone's credit, unlike a lot of Hollywood producers, he didn't just throw Colt single action armies and Model 92 Winchester lever actions into a Civil War setting. And one of the reasons he didn't do that is because he didn't have to. Because, as I had said before, the Italians now had a booming industry in making replicas of cap and ball revolvers and of Civil War rifles. And Leone could tap into that to get all the props he needed. So why not be authentic? Now, Eastwood's Colt single action army revolver with the rattlesnake grips had become iconic and was identified with his man with no name character. Sergio Leone was not going to give that up for historical accuracy, but he didn't have to. So what he did is he commissioned some Colt's 1851 Navy revolvers be made up with inlaid rattlesnakes on their grips. So Colt's single action army had morphed into an 1851 Navy in the Civil War setting. So in the final installation of the trilogy, Clint's character, who's now named Blondie, once again, Leone just great with names, right? Though Tuco, the rat, was phenomenal. Let's be honest about that. But Clint Eastwood now had a Navy revolver, but he was still using his Andy Anderson walk and draw rig. So that 7.5-inch barrel stuck out 2 inches out of the bottom of his holster. But that's okay. Now, Leone's period correctness only went so far. Because for both, certainly for Clint's guns, and in some cases for Tuco's guns, I'll talk about that in a minute, they did not use cap and ball revolvers. They had cartridge conversions made up. So they could fire 38 special blanks in those guns because it just made it easier for the armorers. So the guns that they're firing are anachronistically cartridge firing in 1862, which is when the movie is set, when you really would not have found any conversions at that point. But we can pretend that some blacksmith conversions existed, I guess. Now, Lee Van Cleef's character in this movie was called Angel Eyes. Once again, Leone's right on point with names. And he, as I said, continued to wear the same black Andy Anderson cross-draw holster that he had in the first movie. The difference is, instead of a buntline Colt, now he had a Remington New Model Army stuffed into it. And it's quite a pretty one. It's one with basically a silver frame and blued barrel and brass trigger guard and, that sort of thing. So it's a two-tone gun. And it's quite good looking. Now, it's kind of interesting. Even though the gun belt is loaded with cartridges, the Remington itself is still in cap and ball mode. And when we get a couple of close-ups of it, there is no doubt that it is a cap and ball revolver, sitting right next to those 45 Colt cartridges. Now, Eli Wallach's character, Tuco, also had a Colt Navy, 1851 Navy clone that was converted to fire 38 special cartridges. Unlike the other two characters, Tuco did not use a holster. He had a lanyard tied to a ring on the butt of his revolver that he wore around his neck. And he kept the Navy in his trousers pocket. Now, Tuco's gun has more continuity issues than any other gun in the movie. It started off, obviously, as an octagon-barreled 1851 Navy. And you can see that clearly in the scene where he's mixing and matching parts to put the gun together and loads it with cartridges and goes out and test fires it. However, in some other scenes, the octagon-barreled 1851 Navy has a round barrel, like a Griswold and Gunnison, except it has a steel frame, unlike the Griswold and Gunnison's brass frame. And then in other scenes, it is clearly a cap and ball Navy revolver, not a cartridge conversion revolver. So his gun morphs around throughout the entire movie. And it's easily noticeable once you're looking for it. Clint Eastwood's character uses a couple of rifles during The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The principal one is a Hollywood Henry, which was an 1866 Winchester clone made to look like a Henry rifle by removing the forearm. Now, in the last scene, he has another rifle. Eastwood's final gun in the movie is an Italian replica of a Sharps model 1874 Buffalo rifle. And it would give you a spoiler if I told you what he used it for, but that is the last gun that he fires in the movie. And he fires it to great effect. Those are the guns. And those are the guns that were used throughout the entire Dollars trilogy. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you know what to do. Give it a thumbs up. Make a comment. Those things, by the way, thumbs up and comments, both affect the algorithm and gets more people to see it. That's why I ask you to do it. If you're not a subscriber, I wish you'd subscribe. And if you liked it, I hope you feel like doing that. And until next time, bye.